When it comes to seedlings, they can give you a lot of signs and symptoms of issues, and if you look at the internet for an answer, there seems to be a ton of answers. For wilting plants, it could be overwatering and underwatering. So which one is it? Well, today's video, I'm going to give you a master class in actually identifying your seedlings and issues they may be having. I've broken this down into 3 categories based on the DMs and the comments that the Geek Crew has been leaving, because you guys are so freaking smart. And if you haven't joined the Geek Crew yet, you may want to. Just hit the subscribe button. The comment section is full of people that are smarter than me, and they will help you very lovingly. If I can't get to your content, the Geek Crew will support you 100%. We're a fun group, we're a kind group, and we do not judge. Whether you're organic, conventional, or something in between, we love you. Any hoosers, I broke this into 3 categories kind of based on what you guys have been questioning. The first category is going to be watering issues. The second category is going to be light issues. And the third category is going to be soil/nutrient issues. And this doesn't apply to just indoor grown seedlings, it also applies to outdoor grown seedlings. So let's get into it. Okay, number 1 sign is wilting, or just junky looking leaves. Now this can happen if you overwater and if you underwater. So how do you know which one you're having issues with? The best way to tell is if your plant is wilted and you go to water and then the plant perks up again, or the soil dries out, or only portions of the plant look like they're wilting, that is a sign of underwatering. If you go to water the plant, or you look at the soil and you're like, that soil's still wet and the plant is wilted, that is a sign you are overwatering. So the first one I mentioned, you're like, duh. Like, obviously, if there's no water and it's wilted, it's underwatered. If it's wet and soaking wet and it's still wilted, then it's overwatering. But we need to really hone in on that aspect, because that is going to help us determine the rest of the issues down the line. And the next one is chlorosis. And the reason why we need to know if it's over or underwatering is because chlorosis is a sign of both over and underwatering once again. Now the reason for that is because chlorosis is caused by a lack of nutrients, and this lack of nutrients is solely caused because there's something wrong in the soil. The plant roots are unable to uptake the nutrients in the water it needs to survive and thrive in the soil solution, and because there's a disconnect there, we end up with the chlorosis. It's very specifically, most of the time, a lack of nitrogen and magnesium. Now, fun fact is that tomatoes, peppers, any sort of fruiting plant where you've gotten that blossom end rot at the bottom, that is a plant that you really want to make sure you are not allowing to dry out, because that lack of magnesium, or that cutting off of like magnesium and calcium uptake, while it's happening to the seedling, can actually affect the adult plant. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail towards the end, but it's something to think about, is that we want to try to manage that and make sure it doesn't happen. Now the next one is root rot and mold/fungal growth. So these aren't one and the same, they're 2 different things entirely. Now, one way to know if it's overwatering for sure is if you have something called dampening off. And what that means, or what that looks like, is when the seedling collapses at the soil line. So if the plant above looks fine and the roots below look fine, but it literally right where the soil connects, where the plant comes out of, and that is a sign of too much water or too much humidity, meaning you left the dome on for too long, and so the ambient air is toxic in a way to the seedlings themselves. So just 2 things to watch out for with that one. So the next group of watering category, let's talk about things that are very specifically just for underwatered plants. Number 1 is going to be curling or cupping of the leaves, specifically downwards. Another thing you can see is the actual stems themselves literally forcing themselves down. The reason for this is because the plant is trying to reduce the surface area of the leaf. And the reason why it's trying to reduce the surface area of the leaf, either via smaller leaves or curling or putting it down closer to the plant, is because it's trying to reduce water loss. And when plants cup in on themselves, when they put their stems down, the ambient, oddly enough, around the plant can increase because you have less space for airflow and that sort of thing. So in order to increase the humidity around the plant, it just kind of closes itself up to help reduce the loss, because water that is lost by the plant is literally breathed out. Now, if you see this curling or this cupping downwards and you're like, the water's fine, like the watering's fine, the other reason for this actually is going to be heat. Heat ambiently will also cause this to happen. Heat mats won't cause this to happen. Heat mats will just cause like a really leggy, very floppy plant, typically speaking. But if you're like, my watering's up to snuff, my leaves are still curling, it's very likely a heat issue or very intense light, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. Okay, next one is purple tomato leaves. So I know you guys have seen these, the seedlings that have a purple kind of veining in them or seem just a little bit too purple, if you will. Now, this is caused by a water issue and a nutrient issue specifically. So this is a lack of phosphorus that's causing this kind of purpling color. And lack of phosphorus can be caused by overwatering, underwatering, as well as climate issues. So if your ambient temperatures are too hot or too cold, it also will cause this to happen. So when we think of the soil solution and the plant, you want to think of it as like a big circle. So you have your roots and your water in the soil. It gets sucked up through the straw that is the stem. It goes out to the leaves. It's breathed out into the air around it. And now that has the humidity. And if there's a bottleneck in either the ground or the ambient, that can't take place. And so the soil solution is where all the nutrients is, including phosphorus. So if it can't uptake phosphorus because maybe it's too high, you left the dome on for too long, now air can only hold so much water. And once it's held too much water, it can't take on any more. So despite the plant trying to respire and breathe in that air, it can't. And so the water can't go in the big circle it needs to. It just kind of sits and hangs out in the plant. But your plant's still doing photosynthesis, it's still growing, it's still doing its thing, but it doesn't have a complete cycle. There's a bottleneck on the leaves for the actual water to come out. The other bottleneck is in the roots, so either poor root formation from overwatering or no uptake because of no water being present. And then the other one is heat. So if you ambiently have too much heat and it's going too fast around the circle, what happens then is the nutrients that the plant is uptaking isn't hanging around long enough, for lack of a better way of explaining it. And so that can also cause issues. So you can see how the whole environment has to work together when it comes to humidity and water. They're very interconnected. If you have high levels of humidity, it would be removing that dome or using a dehumidifier if you're like in a greenhouse setting where the whole freaking thing is very humid. The opposite to that would be to leave the dome on or to have like a mister somehow inside of your growing space, as well as temperature control. So if you have it in a basement or a garage, something to think about is maybe covering them or having like a little space heater around them. Or if you have them in a window in a very sunny room and that room is always very hot, you again want to think about fans and air movement and trying to relieve that sort of temperature heat if possible. If you've overwatered and you're like, oh no, I've overwatered, your only real option there is obviously to remove the excess water from any sort of catching tray. The other option is to increase the soil heat and therefore the rates of evaporation through a heat mat on the bottom. Or if you don't have access to a heat mat, you'd want to put it on top of a register, a warm register that's blowing out hot air, or just you want to get it into a warmer space, just overall. Okay, so let's discuss light. I think the most obvious sign is burning or scorching. So this can look different for some people. I typically see it, and the way I've seen it the most is when you have the leaf wherever there's a high point. So say I mean, say this, how do I explain this? You have your ridges on your leaf. So you know how a leaf isn't flat, it kind of goes, undulates, I guess, in a way, between each of the veins in the leaf. The top of so between the two veins, there's kind of a high spot. That high spot is going to be the spot that turns brown or scorches or really bright white, or it looks blistered. That blistering, which you will see quite often actually in cucumber plants that are exposed to too much light, that blistering up there, that is sun scorch, or that is scorching from the lights themselves. And this is not from the water. People oftentimes will say, oh, it's because you watered from the top, you got water on the leaves. It has nothing to do with that. That's false entirely. It has to do with the lights being too close or too intense. So you either need to dim them or you need to lift them up. The other one is photo bleaching. So it is when, this is like before sun scorch. So photo bleaching is when things are really white. You end up with bleached looking leaves. That obviously is too much light. The next sign of too much light or excessive levels of light is when you have leaf issues. So you can have that curling that we spoke about, particularly downwards. It's not going to be an upwards curl. It's always going to be a downwards curl, cupping downwards. The actual stems are going downwards. The other thing that we see could be stunted growth. Now this I have seen without scorch. I've experienced this before with LED lights specifically. And so the best way to understand if this is the case is to look at the plant and think it's been a seedling for a really long time. I feel like it's growing way slower than what these plants normally grow at, or if plants under one light that were all seeded at the same time are drastically smaller and look stunted, small leaves, slow growth. This is all excessive levels of light. And it is so nuanced. It's so nuanced. It's you really got to watch for it and then move quickly, because the plants aren't going to scorch. They just literally decide to grow, or they grow very deformed. Now, another way you can determine if a plant has been exposed to too much light is an increase in trichomes. So trichomes are obviously what we know as smell or oil producing organs on plants for the cannabis world or the tomato world. But trichomes aren't limited to just smell. Trichomes are used to help with stress or navigate stressful situations. So there are trichomes that are designed to deter herbivore activity. There are trichomes to help with actual mechanical manipulation. There are trichomes to help with heat and light and you name it. So one way a plant can try to counteract too much light is by putting a lot of trichomes on it it's like a sunscreen to them. And this may be a sign, it's very specific to certain plants, and you'll know it when you see it, because you'll be like, whoa, that's a really furry looking tomato, or that's a really furry looking plant. That's a sign that you have too much light, because that's not necessarily normal if it's that version of a trichome. And tomatoes, by the way, they have, how many types of trichomes? I did a whole video on this. I'll put it here. But yeah, tomatoes have like a ton of different trichomes. Trust me, like it's not just the glandular ones. First sign of low light is etiolation, and that very simply, because scientists like to use big words for no reason, is just an elongated stem, so leggy plants, and you all know what this looks like. But if you want to sound like a geek crew master, you can just use that word from now on. The other one is yellowing of leaves. So this is different than chlorosis. This is when the leaf as a whole, not just specifically the veins or the actual leaf margins, it's the whole leaf is just a lighter color, and that is a sign of not enough photosynthesis taking place and a lack of chlorophyll because of that photosynthesis not taking place. Now, the other one is just slow or incomplete development. So unfortunately, it's similar to the highlight one, but the difference is going to be that the highlight one is going to have those deformed leaves. If you just have a stunted plant, it doesn't seem to be growing, but what it does put on for foliage looks fine, that's low light issues. If the plant is putting on very messed up looking foliage, like, you know, kind of all bent out of shape, that is too much light, usually. And if you ever are questioning any of these, you're like, I have no idea what's going on, just DM me on Instagram, send me a photo. I will answer. I answer all my DMs. So I will tell you what's going on with it to the best of my abilities. I'm not saying I'm always right, but usually this stuff is pretty easy to catch if you've had to stare at this stuff for a while, like in your entire life. So the next category is soil and nutrients. So the number one thing I see when it comes to soil nutrients is excessive fertilization, very specifically with nitrogen. Now this can cause a number of different issues, but kind of the big three are going to be, number one, it puts on very rapid growth, and this rapid growth is vegetative growth, and this vegetative growth is not as tough of a structure. It's very malleable, very tasty to disease and pests because it is so thin, if you will. The other thing is that when you end up with a lot of vegetative growth from over-fertilization, it actually, even in seedling form, it can reduce the number of flowers and fruits you get because it's heavily vegetative and that's what it's focused on, because of the excessive levels of nitrogen. And then the other one is excessive levels of salt. So fertilizers, organic, conventional, all have salt in them. That's just the nature of the beast. And so an over-fertilization of this can actually cause more salt. And now we'll talk about that here in a little bit because there is salty soil out there as well that you can have issues with. But regardless, you don't want any of these three things to take place. The other thing actually too, there's four, is roots. So your roots won't form properly if they don't have to A, dig for nutrients, or if they're exposed to too much nutrients and it's actually harming the root itself. The poor root development obviously is going to affect the amount of nutrient the adult plant can take up, but it also is going to make that adult plant less structured. It's going to be less able to, hold on through mechanical manipulation, whether it's wind or you walking by it. So it's overall going to cause a weaker plant, and it does start with those roots. What we call the excessive level of greenery that's put on is called the vegetative dominance. So if you want more of a technical term to reference, all that new greenery, vegetative dominance is what we would be referred to in scientific literature. If it's something that you were wanting to Google scholar, that's what you're looking for. The next reason for over-fertilization or not to over-fertilize is actually poor fruit development, and it's an imbalance, truly. So nitrogen in excess it's all nitrogen. Nitrogen in excess can cause a plant to have a watery fruit or a less flavorful fruit, if you will, because it's just rapid expansion, even when the fruits are present, even if there's fewer fruits present, because of that vegetative dominance, what is there is going to be watery in nature, not very tasty. The other reason, other than the rapid expansion, nitrogen competes for other nutrients. In my 17 essential nutrients series, we kind of go through that and we repeatedly say it over and over again. But potassium, for example, is very predominant in flavor of food. And so it can and will directly compete with nitrogen, and nitrogen wins every time. And that lack of potassium in this case can actually cause that watery or tasteless fruit as well. So the high salt, this one again is fertilizer, but it also can be the potting soils sometimes in and of themselves can have higher levels of salt. And this is called osmotic stress. So for osmosis, osmotic stress, osmotic stress. Please, this is like my 5th video today. I'm very tired. It's a Sunday and I had to go into my office this morning for anyways, I'm tired. That stress is simply, there's a difference in gradient in salts between the roots and the soil solution, and this affects the uptake of certain nutrients. Now, the fix to this is actually, when in doubt, flush it out. When you over-fertilize, flush it out. That's always the solution, because a lot of this stuff is highly mobile, highly water soluble, so we can actually get it out of the system nice and quick. Now, this last one is soil specific, outdoors and indoors sometimes, and that is poor or stunted growth. Now, this is important. If you are a potting soil or any sort of a compost that has persistent herbicides in it, or it has maybe really high levels of plant material debris that is toxic, it's an allelopathic biomass, these can affect the germination of seeds, so you'll get really low germination rates. The other thing is, if you've ever seen tomato leaves that are really curled in on themselves, that's another sign of contaminated soil. So best way to avoid this is actually doing a bioassays test. I need to do a video on this desperately to show you guys what I mean by it, but that is something that you want to watch out for and something that can happen to your seedlings. If that is the case, there is no real immediate fix to this. That's the long-term fix if you want to watch that video right there. Short term, your only option is to reseed them and go with a different potting soil. So I hope that helps you guys out. I will talk to you guys